Corinna will now talk about this project and about the interviews we did in more detail from a perspective of a psychologist.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sandra. I think, just a second. I think this slide of Belmondo, Beautiful World, provides a very good example linking in with Domenico how this might be a workshop to overcome some of the social integration problems we heard about in the first presentation. So the reason Sandra, Domenico, and I decided to come together and to look at these benefits in more detail, I think are already fairly clear, just because from the experiences Sandra has sort of talked about, it's obvious that the refugees, but also the locals and students are really taking more out of the workshops than just the kind of learning about construction. And so, see if I can go. And so we decided to look at the experiences, but also the benefits of these workshops in a more systematic way. As we already heard, when we think about refugees, it's typically they are vulnerable, they have mental health problems. But Domenico really nicely discussed about half an hour ago that actually a lot of them are fine. And in fact, a lot of them come with a great resilience or kind of strengths, and they often come with skills which they don't necessarily are able to use. And so staying in a new country and not able to integrate might be actually more of a problem than we previously thought about. There is already a little bit of evidence from the arts trying to foster the dialogue across cultures, but this really has not been applied to architecture. And so the reason I'm coming in today with Domenico and Sandra is to really go from observation to evaluation and to ask kind of what are the experiences and benefits of the workshop. And so I had the pleasure to kind of come along last year to interview the participants. So the aim of our study was to interview, to kind of use interviews to investigate these benefits in more details. And Domenico helped us put together a topic guide for these interviews, slightly different for the refugees, the locals, and the student participants, where we initially asked some icebreaker questions and then followed about the perceived impact of the workshop. So we asked how participants heard about the workshop. We asked if they've been involved in the workshop, and if yes, how. We also asked about the benefits of the workshop, but also about the benefits for the town. And we also ask about downsides. We are really pleased that Federica, who is hopefully still here or back now, Calisano, agreed to transcribe the interviews and conduct the content analysis for us. She is just moving into just finishing her second year as a BSc psychology student, and she is now taking the lead and kind of finishing the study up. So thank you very much, Federica. Great that you're here today. As Sandra already said, we went on to interview 25 participants, the locals. There are two examples sort of on the left, 2 students, here an example of students, and then refugees. And that was really a fantastic experience. Following the analysis that Federica has now conducted, we have emerging themes of the interviews on the sort of experience level and also on the benefits level. And I just want to give you a few examples of the sort of experience and the themes that emerged. So one of them is working together as equals. And I give you a quote from one of the refugees it's kind of, I think it really is really telling. It is a big thing for me. It's a big experience because when I meet you, I want to know you and be close with each other. I don't want you to be afraid of me. Here, we are all curious about each other. If I meet you, I can share a lot with you. It's a big experience for me. So working together as equals. Other themes that emerged as part of the experience is living together. the importance of residential stays in Belmonte and the informal contacts in the bar in the evening, playing cards together, being a big family, and also making home, getting to know the place. And I come back to that at the end of my talk, actually. The concept of the refugees coming here now, and they are willing to create a home here. And if we are providing them with the possibilities, and so on. So making home as an experience. The fourth kind of theme that emerged in terms of experiences was understanding and respecting differences. And again, I give you two quotes, one from a student and one from a refugee. It is beautiful that all these young people from different cultures and languages come here. All different cultures can connect and do things together. This makes things better because we can all learn something new from the others. The other kind of emerging theme is around benefits. And when we talk about benefits, Sandra already briefly mentioned him. We have to mention Luigi, the vice mayor of Belmonte, and he very much supports the project and the opening of the town. And so here's a quote from him. Your research, point of view and way of thinking about this village is very important for us because it is different to the Italian way of seeing things. The community of Belmonte would not have been able to believe and see things as it can now. And then other sort of themes that emerged around the benefits were around creating a space for connection, revitalizing local resources and also promoting attention to deprived towns, broadening horizons, the innovation of the workshops that provides new perspectives, and also regaining or gaining or practicing skills. The fact that the refugees come to a new country often come with skills but may not necessarily be able to use them. And one of the locals sort of said, they all have different ideas, but they all share desire to learn and to do new things. So as you can see from our interviews, we were able to extract some really interesting themes now. So if we put that together, what are the ingredients in terms of the workshop for successful integration? And of course, there are different, like for the locals, it's commercial aspects, but it is also the positive influence that enables change and openness. The students, the hands-on experience, but also working in a diverse group broadens the horizon. So it's not only the construction in the casa, it's also living and kind of coming in contact with very different people. And then the refugees, connecting as equals, sense of belonging to a community and making home. And I think this really nicely links to Domenico's talk at the beginning, the fact that we have to think about social integration and the fact that after 5 years in a new country, mental health problems often become bigger. And here we have a sort of an example of a very sort of naturalistic way of how integration, I think, can happen. During the workshop last year, in addition to the construction work, Matteo Blandford also conducted a workshop where they did a lot of brainstorming and put a fanzine, a short magazine together. And I just want to read one of the things because it really nicely adds to the point we are trying to make. I don't know if you can see it, it's very small here. As we pass through, we find something that belongs to us. We feel at home with what we recognize. The foreshortening on the sea is the same as that seen by Omar from Gorik Island. The silence is the same as the winter spent in Africa when children were the only ones with the grandparents to stay in the village. And on it goes. And I want to point your attention to this picture. I don't know if you can see it, the one with the windows and the door. And during the workshop last year, one of the refugees did these pictures to kind of make the point that one of the views out of a window in Belmonte reminded him very much of home, looking through the door and seeing the water or the background in Senegal. And I think this much better than anything else kind of illustrates the point of making home, or the kind of disconnections, and this is why we put the slide in. So to summarize my my part of the presentation today, on the one hand, we have this picture here again saying that home is a site of memory and meaning, and trying to understand how social integration can form new memories, or kind of linking back to old memories can be a very useful and important add-on, let's say, to social integration. I hope you agree that our analysis has actually identified some important topics. It is clear, at least to us, that these workshops foster a dialogue across cultures. They do create a social climate and a sense of community that facilitates integration and empowerment for the refugees. In order to develop this model, we of course now need to evaluate this in a larger group and kind of need to include many other kind of concepts, but as a sort of starting point to just show that yes, this kind of workshop does increase social integration and is probably a very good sort of starting point to look at alternative ways to foster resilience. And thank you very much. That concludes my part of the talk.
Thank you so much. That's fantastic.
Thanks for completing that.
So I'm also having an internet problem now. I'm so sorry. I don't know what's happening with mine, but I've lost the document that has everybody's bios on it. So Beatrice, I'm going to give you a short introduction. Please complete the more detailed element for yourself. Next up, we've got
Alistair's first.
Oh, of course. It's because I've already introduced Alistair. That's why I was getting confused. Alistair, please take it away. I've already introduced you.
Hi. Thank you. Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Shall I reintroduce you because quite a lot of people weren't around for the introduction?
Can you hear me?
Yes, you hear me? I can hear you perfectly.
Great. Okay.
Yes.
And you can see my screen now, I hope.
Yes.
Can you see the screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Great. Okay. Fine. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to talk from a very different disciplinary perspective, that of a political scientist and educationalist, about young people's views of refugees and young people's views of what home might mean, looking particularly at young German people who I spoke to a lot during the refugee crisis of 2015-2016. What I want to bring to bear on this is how young people, how young Germans, use the term Heimat, particularly in the context of the refugee crisis of 2015. And my argument really is that I want to examine how the impact has been on the ways in which young people construct their own identities, and how this relates to the idea of nation, and to nationalism, and to migration, and to racism. So data comes from a study I've been making of young people's construction of their own identities as political identities over the last decade or so. And I'm basing this very much on open-ended deliberative discussions with these small groups of young people. Usually 6 people in a group between 12 and 19, half female, half male, half middle class, half working class over the groups as a whole, from a variety of different size settlements, small towns, large cities, not just capital cities. And many of them were of non-EU descent. They were of migrant descent themselves, either by birthplace or by descent. And I had colleagues in the towns and cities of these locations, different countries, who helped me find schools, colleges, other small groups I could talk to. My discussions were largely in English, some translation, and sometimes only part translated by my colleague. And the conversations lasted about 50 minutes, some as long as 100 minutes and 100 hours there. Where did I do these? Well, I did it all over Europe over a 6-7 year period. So starting in 2010, working first of all in Eastern Europe, the new European states that joined in 2004, the European Union, and blue there, and in yellow, the states applying to join. And then in 2014, I moved on to look at those new ones coming up there in purple, in darker blue, the older European Union countries and the European Economic Association countries. So I talked to about 2,000 young people in all, 325 odd groups, and scattered, as you can see, widely across Europe. 108 different towns or cities or villages. And in Germany, in January 2016, I was working in 7 locations, ranging from Berlin. These are in thousands, so 3 million and a half million in Berlin, down to a 17,000 village outside Dortmund. And in all 19 groups, 125 young people in Berlin, in Germany, and also in Austria, the previous year, 3 locations, Vienna, Linz, and Innsbruck, 12 groups, it's a smaller country, and again, a range of different sized settlements. So my discussion groups were very, very open-ended and non-directed. I didn't want to put into their minds particular constructs, particular ways of identifying themselves, particular social categories. So I would never use words like nation or state. I would use words like countries. And I would follow up what they said, only using their own language and terms as far as possible. So I accept what they said. I sought disagreement. I said, if you don't agree, I don't expect you to agree. Please disagree. So nation and state weren't introduced until or if one of them used it. I didn't ask about migration or racism. It was always introduced by them. But they determined the terms and the focus. And there were a range of views, and I'm going to try and cover some of that range and offer some generalizations I've made across what they said. Firstly, though, I want to look at the idea of Heimat, which is this particular German word which translates very loosely as home, but has quite interesting political affiliations and meanings. It's much more specific than the way in which we use the word home in the English language. And I came across it, first of all, in 2015 in Austria. 2 of my group members used it without my prompting, one in Vienna, one in Innsbruck. And you'll notice that both of these young people are of non-Austrian origin. Buch is there, young Turkish woman, and she refers to Austria as another Heimat, another home. And Nele, who's from Serbia, feels not so much European, but she has a different homeland, hometown, as well as Innsbruck, and for her it's Belgrade. Now this, as I say, I didn't prompt, it came up. In my 12 groups in Austria, 2 groups raised it by themselves. And Heimat, I was familiar with the term, I didn't, but because I'd come across it 30 years earlier in the films of Edgar Wright, who has produced a series of films for television and for the cinema called Heimat, a German chronicle. And he has this fictional Heimat based on his own family experiences. He's been making the films ever since 2000 and 1988, I think, first of all. And they last in all something like 60 hours. Watching the whole, I saw it on television in the UK. It's a story, starts off as a story of a soldier returning to a village in the area called the Hunsrück, which is on the west bank of the Rhine, to a fictional village called Schabak. A soldier comes back from the front, walking alone, and meets up with his own family, and then is the story of the changes of the family through the years up to the 1980s, particularly through the experiences of the mother here, Maria Schlemmer, and her death in '82, and then he goes on with more films that go back in time to see the village in the past, all around and right through to the German Nazi period, right through to explore the changes that were taking place in the area and how this affected the concept of Heimat. That was the running theme through it. The home they all felt they identify with in various ways. Now, Heimat is a theory that's been looked at very closely by political scientists, and it's been analysed particularly in terms of the Nazi period. There was the notion of Heimatlos people who had no homes, who hadn't got a Heimat, and these were said to be the Jewish minorities. And later on, Calvino here says that after 45, West Germans talked about Heimat very much as a way of having a new national identity. They articulated Heimat, both victimhood, guilt feelings for the lost territories, as well as thinking of Heimat in the making. So Heimat wasn't backward looking necessarily, wasn't a false hegemony of the past. Heimat was an integrative symbol for them, he says, and also exposed social tensions around German national identity. And Bickel comments that Heimat is very much embedded in the contemporary renegotiations of what it means to be a German. So when I went to talk to German young groups a year later, I deliberately introduced the term Heimat, and I asked them specifically, very unusually for my process, what Heimat might mean. Did they use the word Heimat and what it meant for them? And found comments like this: Heimat isn't the whole country of Germany, but it's the house they live in. Or Heimat is my town, my city, Dortmund. Or Heimat is where you feel at home and where you spend time in a smaller village, Altwickede there. And in Forst in East Germany, there's a difference between my home and my Heimat. My Heimat's a little village south of the city, where I lived till I was 12 and grew up, and now my home is in Cottbus-Town, which is 20 kilometers to the west of where we were. But Heimat, to me, is always my village. And interestingly, this is Forst, where I was working. You can see there, her village is Weißengrund, which is just about 7 kilometers away. Weißengrund is tiny, 1,500 people. And others in that area, also in that city or town, also used the term Heimat a lot. Sometimes it's very large. It's a province of Brandenburg, because her brothers live in Berlin and in Magdeburg, so all in the Heimat. Others it's much smaller, or it's Forst itself, or it's the region of Lausitz. Heimat is where I can find my family, my friends, my home. So Heimat is here being used in former East Germany. It's not going to be no longer a West German integrative function, having integrative function in the eastern parts as well, and being used in a variety of ways, but not in that nationalistic sense, or very large enough in that nationalist sense in which it had been used in the 30s. Heimat can actually move sometimes. So Gerd here talks about him having moved at various points and his Heimat being in different places at the same time. So it's a multiple functional operational thing going on. Now, Heimat here is used by as well by, as in Austria, by two people of migrant origin in Dortmund. Lily here was born in Russia, but became a German citizen actually on the very day I was talking to her. It came through. And this is how they relate, they say they relate to it, to the idea, how they use the term. You can have more than one Heimat, says Lily. She feels good in Russia, but she also feels good in Germany too. Heimat's where my friends are, where I was raised, but also in Tehran a little bit, because my grandparents live there, and I speak Persia. I want to know about the country. That's part of me too. Sorry, that's... bear with me, I've slipped up with my process here. I'm going to just go through very quickly to get to where we were. Right, and others came in with other countries as well. Thekla here, who's from Sri Lanka, where she was born, but Sri Lanka is her Heimat land, and within it, that a small city. Lorena has a Heimat in Kosovo, not the whole country of Kosovo, two particular areas where her father and was brought up in his childhood and where his family were, and then in Peja, where they moved to after that, and they go back to it every summer. So maintaining identities in that way with places that they'd migrated from. And here is Heimat being used in terms of how the migrants who were arriving the year before must feel. They had to leave their Heimat because they were refugees and because there was a war in their country. So Heimat's being transferred, imagined, imposed into the imagined identity problems a refugee might have, stresses that they might have. They had their Heimat that they had to leave. It must have therefore affected them. And here is a member of the Green Party speaking, writing about Heimat. And he says he sees Heimat as positive. This is in response to the notion that Heimat is a remnant of the Nazi past, a remnant of the 30s. And he says you can't leave Heimat to the right. Heimat is where you grew up, where you know you belong, where it makes friends. It's not negative, nor should it be. And particularly in the age of globalization, Heimat is important. You can lean on the tradition and gain security in this. This guy is now, I think, leader of the Green Party in Germany. And going back to Peter Blickel, the fragmentation, the pluralization of identities and Heimat go hand in hand. It's reflexive, a part of dislocation and crisis in these different spheres. And this, I think, in a way, influences the ways in which the young Germans I spoke to responded to the migrants in January 16. We need to integrate people who are excluded from society, disabled people or currently refugees, because there are countries that have closed the border and we have to try and help them. And in some of the smaller countries, there was some hesitancy. In Forst, for example, immigrants wear scarves, and maybe they'll think we'll have to do this too. There's a little bit of tension going on there. We have to change their minds because they could be lazy, they could become dependent upon us. Those minority comments, but they were there. I think I should reflect those. But there were more people who wanted to accept diversity, although there were some hesitancy on the part of people of migrant origin themselves. Petros and August, respectively Greek and Turkish, were a little bit hesitant about, they're born in Germany, but their parents had come from those countries. And they were a little bit hesitant about that, but again, that was a minority view. Most people were very accepting of refugees. In Forth here, through their family experiences of a sister's boyfriend being a refugee, a nice guy, my mother working with the refugees, and how wonderful it was to see her feeling those young children smile. And he was really impressed by the way his mother was motivated to do that. Why were Germans positive about accepting refugees? Well, I think I found 4 particular reasons. One was a reference back to the 33 to 45 period. We were the bad ones in the past in history. We now have to be the good ones. We're haunted by our past, and we have to get away from that. That was a set of reasons by several young people, but the minority one, more important, was the 45 to 51 experience, when the moving borders in that part of Europe meant we had great numbers of displaced people, far than the 1 million of 2016. There was something like 12, 15 million people on the move, largely coming to Germany from that part of Germany that had been moved to become part of Poland from East Prussia and from the large stretch of territory, and also people from the area of Czechoslovakia that had been incorporated, had large German settlers that had prompted the Anschluss, the Czech crisis in 1939, and they remembered grandparents, ancestors who had fled as refugees from both from the territories that had become part of Poland, and also from East Germany to West Germany. And that had led to people feeling a lot about the way in which they had experienced the same things in their families, and they thought they should repeat that experience of acceptance, of setting people in, of accepting migrants without question, to do so in the 21st century. Third reason was population decline. We're getting smaller. And one group here in Berlin said, we only got one German in this group. Germany needs these refugees. We're dying out. More important, though, was more general, was a general humanistic response. Our generation doesn't have to feel guilty about the past. We have to handle it and know what happened, but we should just simply welcome refugees. It's part of our communal values. In Western countries, we should help each other. We should manage the situation. We're wealthy. We have a responsibility to other countries. We're in much worse condition. There's so many interconnections. It's a globalized world. We have to help people who are not so well off now. And I'm coming to an end. And there was also anti-nationalism and a distrust of the media. And young people in Germany have a particular concept of home and space, rooted in particular locations and contributing to their personal sense of identity. Generally a discrete location in the country rather than the state, still less with the nation. And these two factors contribute to young Germans' sense of empathy with migrants. Their history of Germany, not simply pre-war and wartime, but thereafter, and also a culture of universal European human rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alistair. That was fascinating and such an interesting adjunct to the previous presentations. So now let's invite Dr. Beatrice De Carle to speak. She is Senior Lecturer in Urban Design at London Met, and she's recently joined the team from the University of Sheffield. Beatrice is also General Manager at Architecture Sans Frontières UK, a non-profit organisation that works between architecture and community and development practice. Both as an academic and a practitioner, her work focuses on the socio-spatial dimensions of design in the urban contexts of Europe and the global south. Beatrice, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to join the discussion. So as Jane was just mentioning, I have this double affiliation that I will be talking through. So I'll be largely discussing some of the topics that were raised in the initial questions of this event. As an affiliate and associate of Architecture Sans Frontières UK, and I would be also bringing in this my own reflections on some of the work that I do with ASF. And the way I'm entering this conversation is by looking at how participatory design can contribute to making home, or to discussions on making homes. And in many senses, as Sandra also mentioned earlier, my work is situated in a slightly different field from what we saw a few minutes ago, and through Sandra's presentation. I mainly work in urban contexts, and also this piece of work is not explicitly focused on questions of migration and refugee. So some of these questions will sort of cut across the work that I do with ASF, but it's not a specific focus of the presentation as well. But rather, I'll be talking about this notion of home and how we might be approaching it within ASF's work. So as a, sorry, finding how this operates. Sorry, I seem not to be able to go to the next slide. Okay, here we are. So as an initial point, I'd like to introduce briefly Architecture Sans Frontières UK. Some of you might be familiar with it, not least because Matthew Barrack had played a key role in starting this organization. And generally, ASF UK is at the moment is a relatively small charity that is part of a much wider network of organizations that go under the umbrella of ASF International. And within this network, ASF UK plays a quite specific role because it is an organization that doesn't focus on designing or building facilities, but the entire focus of the work that we do is around learning and around developing capacities and around education. So again, so the way the organization describes itself, the way we talk about ASF UK is as a non-profit design organization that aims to build the capacity of both professionals and urban professionals and urban communities to participate in the co-production of equitable cities. So some of these terms are quite key also in the discussion that I will be presenting. And first of all is this focus on capacity, and as I was saying, on learning, and on the idea that we use design in a sense as a method for fostering learning opportunities. And then the second very important point is that the focus of ASF is to work on equity within urban environments. So there's a very strong advocacy and activist position that the organization takes in engaging with questions of design. And what I've been largely involved in over the past 9 years with ASF UK has been a program within the organization that is called Change by Design, that has as its tagline, imagining equitable cities. And Change by Design is a program that unites a quite broad series of activities, including workshops and sort of live projects that sort of longer term live projects. And all of these activities have in common the fact that through those we are exploring how participatory design and participatory planning can become a tool for advancing social justice and advancing equity in an urban environment, and especially, let's say, a particular focus of this work is on understanding how can we use design and planning as means to deepen participation in decision making. So how can we use this tool to expand the scope of participatory processes and so to include a multitude of voices in which decisions are made in cities. So an important aspect of this work is that we operate through very strong strategic partnerships with local organizations in different parts of the globe. And most of these partnerships are normally with NGOs that are or other non-profit entities that are already active in the context where we intervene, and that normally have their focus on social development and social development practice, and might feel in a particular moment a need for design and planning support in the work that they're doing. So our primary interlocutors, in a sense, are other NGOs, and through them we work with local communities, and this focus on learning is developed both with these partners as well as with the local communities, in trying to understand how they together can affect change in the cities where they're living and operating. So through this work, there is generally a very, again, an important focus and point of attention towards equity. How do we understand equity in the built environment, and how do we understand also the structures that create inequality in cities? The activities that we've developed within Change by Design have started around 10 years ago through a series of workshops in Salvador, in Brazil, and since then we have worked in a number of cities, including the ones that you're seeing on this list. And at the moment we are primarily active in London and in Freetown. So traditionally the focus of the work that I've also been doing with ASF and with the Change by Design program has been on informal settlements. So we've been mainly working on the areas of informality, particularly in global south contexts. But then at the same time, we do understand our context of working as places of contestations and places where there are tensions happening around questions of urban planning primarily. And this is how also we make sense within this broader set of contexts of our work in London, which mainly focuses on urban regeneration and social housing. So through all of these activities, so I'm going to slow cause the, okay. Through all of these activities, an important point of reflection for us is how do we understand power dynamics in space and in the space of our cities. And a lot of this reflection revolves around the role that the production of space plays in relations of power. So on the one hand, we are looking at how different forms of power, oppression, and exclusion are manifested in cities, but at the same time, we are also interested in understanding how oppressions and exclusions are produced through space, but also how they can be challenged through spatial production. And this is where the strongest link is then with the sort of more creative and future-looking sort of aspects of design and architecture, where we try to understand how, by producing spaces differently, we might be able to engage with some of those questions of power. So through this lens of an understanding of powers and contestation is also how I somehow connect the Change by Design work to this notion of home. And I would say that in the work that we've been doing within ASF, and this is my own interpretation, I'm not speaking for the organization in the moment, but I would say that within that work, there is an understanding of the home place that is related to understanding homes as also sites of contestation and of struggle. And I articulate this by referring to the work of Black feminist Bell Hooks, who wrote a very important piece around 30 years ago entitled Home Place, the Site of Resistance, where she's discussing the act of making home as an act of resistance to oppression. So in her own work, I'm familiar with it, but there's a part of not knowing exactly the audience. But in her own work, Bell Hooks is focusing on the experience of African American people, and in the experience, she talks more explicitly about African American women and how they resisted the oppression and the violence, and they resist the oppression and the violence that they experienced by making homes, by creating places that are places of refuge in a sense, but that are also places of humanization, as she says, and places where one could rebuild their sense of humanity in the face of oppression and exclusion. And related to this concept is for me also another key concept that we actually try to work through within the ASF work, which is the notion of intersectionality. And again, the idea of intersectionality comes from Black feminist tradition. In particular, it was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a Black feminist legal scholar, who used the term of intersectionality to address how different and overlapping systems of power and exclusion might have a cumulative or multiplicative effect with each other. So typically, when Kimberly Crenshaw brought this concept to the forefront, she was discussing how sexism and racism actually not only add to each other in the experience of women of color, but they have a sort of multiplying effect. So that the type of oppression that women of color in the United States were experiencing would be amplified by the fact that these different power structures intersected. But generally, we try to work through this concept within the work of ASF as a way of understanding how struggles to make home and to make one's own neighborhood and one's own city are experienced in very different ways because of different positions. So in concrete terms, one consequence that this notion has for us is in trying to never to conceive of communities as homogeneous entities, and sort of try to understand also in the quite extremely deprived contexts where we work, what are the power differentials and who has a voice and who is able to sort of articulate or to advance their own claims and articulate their needs and desires. So what all this means now within the change by design work and methodologies, that within that work we attempt to read space as a way of understanding the connections between how spaces are produced and the production of power. So what we try to do is to use participatory design and visual methodologies to somehow expose, but also to challenge the role that space plays in the inclusion and exclusion of particular groups. So looking again at the more sort of practice work that ASF does, and looking at how this goes into action, the Change by Design program has developed over the years sort of a loose methodology that we use in engaging with places, and it's a methodology for participatory design and planning. And I will not explain all the details of it, but what is important to highlight is are some of the components that you see on the left, and is that we, within this methodology, we enter these discussions on power through different scales of space and scales of spatial production. We don't understand this rigidly, but we see this as different ways of entering and understanding people's experience of their city, and we name these scales as dwelling or a home scale. There is a focus on a scale of community and neighborhoods, and a focus on the wider city scale and wider city dynamics. And the other element to highlight is that green box that you see on the right, is that then all of this work is geared towards producing some tools for collective action and for mobilization. So of these tools are action plans, community action plans, or sort of forms of types of documents that can outline a way forward and speak to urban policy and planning. So looking again at the methodologies I was mentioning, there are these different scales through which we enter a discussion on cities and power dynamics. And this, through this, at each of these scales, we use creative and sort of design-based methodologies to engage in conversations with, oh, thank you. I'll cut it in the next 2 minutes. So we engage in conversations at each of these scales through design methods, and then bring those scales together into a thinking about how the different experiences and of space and different experiences of as well of exclusion, inclusion can be renegotiated when looking at those together, so across these different scales of design. And we'll make a short example talking about the work that we do at the dwelling scale. And dwelling is yet another word that we use within the methodology to talk about homes and to talk about the making of homes. And we use this word that comes from the work of Amos Rappaport to look at so we started using this word to look at how we might break from the idea of the house as the place that constitutes home within informal settlement specifically, and the word dwelling is pointing towards the understanding of their home-based activities as a system of settings. In the work of Amos Rappaport, activities settings might take place within the house, but at the same time they might also take place in a variety of different locations. And I use sometimes this map to explain this concept, because this is one of the quite simple drawings that were created by one of our participants to a workshop in Nairobi in 2011, where the person was mapping the home spaces of a little girl called Evelyn, and she was mapping out how the places that she associated to her home, including the place where she would use the toilet or go to play or watch TV, were actually located in quite different settings within the settlement that we were working in. And so the word dwelling allows to engage with this dynamics, and also allows us to see how what are the factors that influence this, and what are the, in a sense, the positive and negatives associated to this geography. So I will, sorry, I'm conscious of everyone's time, so I'll go through this now quickly. But just to give a few, the images you're seeing, I will just give you a few examples of the type of activities that we do through that focus on the dwelling, where there is a phase of understanding people's home conditions, and then of dreaming and imagining how those conditions might be transformed. And then through later stages, we sort of bring together, as mentioned, in those different scales, to understand how individual and personal experiences and needs and desires might be negotiated across a broader collectivity. And this is what we do through the exercise that I mentioned earlier of bridging scales. And finally, the outcome of much of this work, as I again mentioned earlier, is the production of tools for action. So recently in the work in Freetown, for instance, we've been focusing on the development of a number of planning tools, so which we call community action area plans, that are meant to bring some of these discussions and sort of link back all of these personal experiences to policy making, and trying to influence how policies around, in this case, Freetown's informal settlements are shaped and defined. So, as a way of concluding, I think there are a few, again, reflections on how, in my experience with ASF, participatory design as a process has been linked into the act of homemaking, and again understanding the home place in bell hooks words as a potential sites of resistance and of emancipation. And there are these three key points that emerge for me. One has to do with learning and the ways in which participatory design can support participants, in our case of residents within informal settlement, in seeing, in a sense, the conditions that might create their exclusion and marginalization, but also in imagining what can be done about it and imagining alternatives. A second point links to something that Sander mentioned earlier as well in terms of creating network, and it's the idea that through participatory design, in our experiences, the design of space and engaging with people in conversations about their own home spaces has allowed to create connections amongst common experiences and also based on shared values. So these are connections that we see happening across difference and without somehow forgetting or without trying to homogenize difference and diversity, but trying to work through it and to negotiate it. And then the final point has to do with how participatory design and planning more broadly might also help to give voice to some experiences and claims, and then bring them to decision-making tables and then try to influence decision-making. So thank you. This was my contribution. Sorry for running over time.
Thank you very much. Please don't worry about running over time, because I, for one, thoroughly enjoyed that. It was a really interesting presentation with some beautiful slides. So thank you so much. So we don't have an enormous amount of time left for discussion today, unfortunately, because of our problematic internet issues in the middle of the session. So if anyone in the audience has got questions, please do put them in the chat and I'll invite you to ask them. I wonder if we might kick off with the presenters for any questions, comments for one another. I was particularly struck by the range of methodological approach across.
Hello? I think we've lost.
So does anyone have anything? Just chip in.
Yes, hello, I'm here. I don't know how many we are, but
Ask one of your colleagues.
Jay, we didn't hear everything. I'm not sure if you're still here.
Can anyone actually hear me?
yes, we can hear you.
Yes.
Sorry, my internet is not great.
Hi, everybody. It's Colin.
Hear me?
Jane and I are just switching computers so that you can see her. Hang on.
Shall we listen to Mana's question? Mana, are you there?
Hello. Yeah. So I'm just trying to type the question. Would it be okay to say it verbally?
Yeah.
Please say it, yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. So my name is Manoir. I worked with refugee with the international like ICRC, International Committee of the Red Cross, and now I'm doing my master's at London Met. So I'm just like, listening to all these presentations. Like the ideas of the research is so amazing and it's so interesting. My question is, are these research, did they start based on a need that we noticed within the refugees community, or is it driven by the researcher's interest? Like, and also, because also like when like throughout my work, I just also kind of noticed that some of the projects that are implemented with the refugees, they depend on funding. They depend also on values coming maybe from the West, but maybe that the need in the community, like the refugee community, it's not what they need. So I'm just interested to know like what is the drive of the research, you know, like and the presentations that we listen to. So this is the question.
So do you want to know what the core driving factor was?
Yes. Yeah. So is it the need of the refugee? Did we notice that this is what they need? Is it a community need? Or is it because of our interests as academics or professionals, you know, or researchers?
Great. Yeah, thank you, Manar. Sorry, I'm going to cut you off there because we're a bit short of time. But does anybody in the panel move to answer that question? I think we'll probably
I'm
not
happy
have everyone
to
answer it.
give a first attempt. And,
yeah, please do,
and
Domenico.
Then, yeah, I mean, in terms of the mental health research, there was an enormous drive at some point to understand what was the size of the mental health issues in the refugees population, and this drive arguably didn't come from refugee population themselves. It came from governments who didn't know what to do about it and how to help. So the drive in many cases came from the governments to say, what do we have to do? Is it true that refugees have very high mental health needs? What are the best way to support them and stuff? And I do agree there's very little is done in a way, starting from a perspective of what can help, what is important for the refugees population themselves. And yeah, I mean, it's a very important point.
Maybe we could take an answer from one of the architectural researchers as well, as I'd be interested in the contrast.
Maybe can you hear me?
Yeah.
Well, I would say that we explained that, I think, also quite well, is that we have 3 different groups, and we didn't start with the refugees. We probably started with the students, but we brought together locals, students, and refugees. And I would still say that as much as we are now also researching how the workshops we do and bringing these different 3 groups together can help refugees, we are also very much interested in how can we, help or contribute to the understanding of 3 different groups, which include refugees, but it's not starting from refugees.
I think
Alistair,
that we
you
were,
look like you want to say something.
I think we were all working from the
Karina, do just jump in.
That we wanted to listen to people and to understand them rather than to bring preconceptions about what they need, what people need, and to understand that what they said about themselves, what they said they felt, their constructions of need or whatever, were the things that would empower them rather than us imposing solutions. I think that's true. It seems to me of all the approaches we've heard today, is that was an underlying approach, that it was a listening exercise as much as it was a doing exercise.
Great, thank you. Karina, does your comment or question relate to Manar's question about the motivation, or is it something different? I think we're having general connection trouble again. Matthew, do you want to jump in with your question?
Yes, if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. It is actually it is both a question and a comment, but I think also, just given the time that we have left, what is really interesting about this session, it seems to me, is the interdisciplinarity, and I must congratulate everybody involved in curating the range of disciplines and the range of topics, because it is in that difference that those who are kind of patient and really listen can understand. And it's a shame we lost so many people. But the point that I was just going to make, also to come back to Manar's very direct question, because I have done research in extremely sensitive areas where people say to me, how dare you walk around with a clipboard when people are dying? And I think that that task that we are setting ourselves of genuinely understanding is so important, because coming up with responses to questions that are the wrong answers is pointless, especially when it comes to architecture or infrastructure. Because if you're spending huge amounts of money developing government policies to come up with the wrong answers, or to deliver the wrong answers because you haven't done the proper research, that obviously is a massive waste of time. And it is in listening to these different disciplines to bring, you know, epidemiology back to placemaking, back to mental health and so on. That's where the richness comes in. So I hope we're going to do this again and not have technical problems next time.
I really hope so too. Karina?
Thank you very much. Sorry, that was my microphone that was muted. What I find really interesting, coming sort of just from my little discipline, listening to the talks today, we have the social integration that we want to increase. Then Sandra and I talked about the kind of the workshop as a way of maybe moving it forward, and then listening to the concept of Heimat. Obviously that very much resonates with me as a German, but I think what I really like about the concept, it allows for having multiple homes. It allows for bringing the memories of and I think that's the drawing I was briefly talking about, bringing the kind of memory of growing up and kind of the identity into the place where you're now, but that you can move that sort of sense from one place to another, and then kind of bringing it back to the refugees. How, in a sense, can we make more of it, or how can we use these workshops to kind of increase that? So, and I kind of thought it was just really interesting, again, these different presentations coming together.
I've really enjoyed seeing the completely different methodological from different disciplines, but yet noting the amount which they have to say to each other. I am wondering if you are all willing, if we could just continue until 7:10, because this question session has been painfully short and it feels that there's a lot unsaid. So audience, please feel free to leave if you need to go. But for the sake of intellectual curiosity, I would really like to continue for another 10 minutes if everybody here is willing. Is that okay?
Yep.
Great.
That's fine.
So,
yeah, that's fine.
Don, I wonder if we could bring you into, I'm not sure if it was a question or a comment, but I thought it was very interesting about the nature of participant observation and architecture. If you're still around.
Who are you asking to speak?
Don McCrailed.
Yeah.
I think it was Don who said the thing about the anthropology.
Don left some time ago. Don left quite a while ago.
Did he? Oh, okay.
I think
well, in that case,
yes, he would have had to leave. We've got the students' big idea challenge on simultaneously.
Oh, of course, yes.
He probably had to show the face of that.
I know
maybe
Morris
I
has
could
been
ask
waiting.
it instead then. Pardon, say again.
Yes, yes, I'd like to say something when there's a moment. So.
Please do, Morris. Yes, sorry, I didn't see your hand up or anything.
I was with regard to the question from Manar about do we ask the refugees what they want? I think the first point is that if you concentrate on place as your the constituency that you're addressing, that place will contain refugees, but it will also contain local people. And so the integration, what we're addressing is the issues that come together to with the problem of integration. And when you say, what are we trying to do? What we're trying to do is to find a way that our skills, whether they're architectural or whether they are psychological, psychiatrists or whatever, what can we contribute to the situation with the skills that we've got? And the way to do that without having an ulterior motive or taking on some power group that you don't want necessarily to represent, you define the place, or all the choice that you make as the architect is the dotted line around that thing, and you call that place. And that's the most honest thing you can do. Beyond that, one doesn't really have the resources. So there is a limitation to what we can do, and it's a contribution to a discourse, and it's an attempt to involve as many people into as possible. It's not a fully funded solution to a problem. It's a contribution to a discourse, and that's what I wanted to say.
No, interesting. Good point, Maurice. I wonder how that sits with maybe what looks to me like a more traditional form of academic research that you're undertaking, Alistair.
I wouldn't say that mine was a traditional form of academic research. It was very much a personal inquiry, and it was a one person, me doing it all. I was semi-retired. I had time, which made it cheap and possible. And I was developing I had a long-standing interest in how people define themselves, if they define themselves, and the kind of categories that they use. I wanted to simply to explore the varieties of ways in which people describe themselves and categorize themselves, the kind of constructs I came up with. Very open-ended in the sense that I had no real hypotheses. I still have no hypotheses about it, other than to observe that one's identity is constructed multiply, and it's constructed very much in response to particular contingencies and contexts. How you describe it depends on who you're talking to, when you're talking to them, where you're talking to them about. So place is a key element of that, but also is time, and our identities are kaleidoscopic in the sense that they move around in patterns dependent upon these contingent events.
Thank you. I'm trying to ask everybody here, if anyone has any follow-up questions or new questions, please put them in the chat. I've accidentally asked you if you're sewing a question, then please put it in the chat, but I meant brewing. I have a question for Beatrice and anybody else that wants to answer it, but particularly Beatrice with your work with Architecture Sans Frontières. I'm intrigued to know if the first presentation from Domenico, if there's been work that relates what you do in terms of empowerment and the creation of networks with other types of measurable outcomes, such as mental health, statistics on mental health.
That's a thank you. There might be. I'm not aware of work linking that directly, like in terms of design-based work that makes the connection. And so there might be.
And any other?
There is. I'm aware of some work with
mental health, but other
hospitals. Oops.
Sorry, Domenico, can you say that again? I didn't catch it.
I'm aware of some work in a very specific issue, which is how you design wards in hospitals in order to facilitate connections between people. I'm not sure in the wider population you would normally look for that kind of outcomes, because as I said, like mental health outcomes, like proper mental disorders, likely don't affect all the population. So it's very hard to have an outcome in an intervention that you do in a general population, which focuses specifically on mental health. So yeah.
I suppose that I was more intending to ask Beatrice about indicators, like measurable indicators of, I suppose, other types of. The reason I'm asking this question is because in my own work, there's always this focus on how do you measure the value in what we're doing. And obviously you can talk about empowerment and you can talk about creating networks and so forth, but what really gets, people's juice is these measurable indicators of value. I just wondered if there's if that sort of work takes place. That's all.
The way I can at least speak about my research and the way we assess impact in ASF's work is probably more qualitatively based, but it's mainly looking at policy impact. So in that sense, there's an important distinction in the type of work that we do there, because then the final outcome that we are aiming for, so those collaborations, is to change policy frameworks. So that's then how we measure whether the work is at the the outcome that we were hoping for. So when a new planning instrument is introduced, or when land regulation change from a settlement, or when there is a different right to stay being defined, then that's the impact that we look for.
And is that what motivates you to go back to the question of why are you doing these things that was asked earlier by Mana?
Yes, yeah, it's very much what motivates these conversations, and largely also the contribution that so that there are other impacts that then we measure and try to assess that have to do with learning, and I think that's also a major sort of motivation is to again, I think Matthew would actually talk about this as well. But the moment when ASF was started was very much with the idea of impacting on architectural education and rethinking how, in a different moment from now, when life projects were maybe not such a prominent feature in many fields of architecture, there was thinking around how do we make architecture more directly linked to society and to what happens out there. And I think some of those, that has been a motivation, I think, for everyone involved in that work, and me included, is how do we make those connections between education and practice and create forms of practice that are more strongly connected to social justice.
Matthew in the chat has just made a very interesting point about the ethical approach of the researcher, and it struck me, in fact, that all of your work is strongly based in your own ethical position of how you'd like the world to be. Matthew, do you want to say something about what you've written?
Yeah, well, it came up in part today because we were having studio presentations by Morris's group, and I don't want to steer it all to being about architecture. But I think these issues about where and this refers to, you know, the HIMAT work and the mental health work as well, where we are treating we can call them those who are participating in the research, but they are essentially the source of our data. They're our informants. They may well benefit from the research in all kinds of ways. And in the work that Sandra and Karina are doing together, I think that there are real potentials for the participants to benefit and to co-produce and own that research. But they need to know what they're going to get out of it. You know, when I've spent time going around shanty towns with a clipboard, people come up to me and say, can I give you the right answer to the question you're going to ask, because I might get something out of it. And we need to be so careful about that, because, you know, we need to have people's consent for them to be part of our research, but also for them to know that if they're going to be part of it, the benefits that they might get are up to them to own. And this is another, like, very, very fascinating part of the interdisciplinarity of this kind of conversation. And it again, I mean, it bears really half a day to have to have a conversation about it, where we can really get to grips with and work on some of these questions.
Let me quickly.
Well, that seems like a.
Sorry, let me quickly jump in on this, just because I think from our point of view, there's a very simple answer, and that is yes, absolutely. And for all our work and all the participants we interviewed, they all got a sort of an information sheet, and they all had to sign a consent form. And one of the bits we talk about is what are the potential benefits, and quite often is just saying we are getting more information. And so I completely agree. And where it becomes interesting is when you look at the different disciplines, because they obviously have different approaches to it, that you need to kind of keep in mind.
Yeah, I think obviously I agree with Corona, but I also, in response to what Matthew was saying, or contribution to it, what do the people get out of it? I mean, it's a difficult one to juggle between what Alistair actually showed us, that his methodology is inquiring, not imposing. So you don't really know what we are going to get out of it. And to a certain extent, you know, how can you tell people this is what you're going to get out of it if you don't really know what it is? So it's a balance one needs to juggle.
Yeah,
because I really like Alistair's methodology, and yeah.
Hello, hi.
Domenico?
So adding to what Sandra was saying, I think there is, like, this project we were doing, we were trying to come with a theory of what we are doing can change mental health, improve quality of life. So we are trying to think about along with participants. So at this stage, they will not get anything out of it. Really, it's more like they're helping us to formulate the theory of what they could get out of it. I think, I mean, there is a lot of ideology, and I'm very much in favor of like asking people what they want before we embark in things. But sometimes it's also like like thinking about a constructionist paradigm. Like we develop it together with people rather than asking them what they want. It's because it might be that actually we are aware that what are the resources are. We have some technical knowledge that people might not have. So I think like I think the idea is not to just ask people what they want and try to deliver, but rather to say like let's sit somewhere together, have a dialogue, and understand what we can get to and whether this will make a difference to your life.
So there's lots of hands. Chris, you had a comment about what people are saying.
Yes, I was. This question has clearly been around for a long time, and when we've tried to work in shanty towns in Africa and in India, we've been surprised how people wanted to participate in this sort of work. But occasionally, you come across people who treat you as a donor, who think they're going to get something out, as Matthew was describing. And I've always called that the victim culture. And when I've come across that, I found it's absolutely impossible to do the sort of work that we're trying to do, and you have to pull right out because it doesn't work. Similarly, when you come across organizations that are slightly corrupt in some way, so you can't work in that situation. And unless you can establish a way of working where it's not how much you can get out of it, but how you can work with others to make something for all of you, that this works. And so what we're trying to do is to, with the words we use, create a common ground of difference. And it's not everybody that benefits from that. If you've got enough money to do it yourself, often you won't cooperate. And if you've got no money at all, you don't have the resources to cooperate because you're looking for the next meal. So it is a specific group of people who are able to cooperate in the way that I think we're talking about, defined by place.
Beatrice?
Sorry, I must have been issues of connectivity. But I also wanted to link and add to this discussion started by Matthew, and I was thinking that for me at least one very important point of the ethics discussion is what is the research framework or paradigm that I work through, and in my case, like there's the idea of participatory action research is actually very central. So we are through the research I am trying to affect change, and so the ethical issues that are related to that are partly not resolved but addressed through partnerships and working with organizations that are in the field and that can take forward some of the findings and the discussions and sort of can take ownership of the research. And for me, this is quite a key element to think through, is who do we do this research with, and who has a stake and a voice in shaping the research.
Yes, absolutely. Matthew?
Yeah, I completely. Beatrice is as usual, totally on point here. But I think that this is exactly the issue around what you can do with the research and what the risks are. I remember I did a piece of research for the government just over 10 years ago, and part of this was for the Department of Health and the communities and local government around housing for older people. And a key purpose of that report that we wrote was to raise develop awareness in the public, raise expectations, and have an impact on policy. Not raise raise aspirations. That's the phrase that was used. And the purpose of it was to say to people who are growing older, you need to expect more and demand it from policy and from housing developers. But you can't go into a place that is poverty-stricken and start raising expectations or aspirations unless you can let people know the limitations of what you're offering. And those ethical challenges that we have as researchers are so interesting and so important. But underneath all of it, if we can communicate to the people that we're working with, especially if it's participatory research that is trying to effect change, what we need to do is continue to preach and share the importance of improving understanding, because once people understand and can own their position better, especially collectively, then they are beneficiaries. Sorry, that was my little...
Thank you, Matthew. Beautifully phrased. A nice ending moment, and I'm sorry to have to bring it to an end, but it's 7:20, and I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I hope that it's the beginning of a longer conversation with potential to lead to deeper collaboration in this interdisciplinary forum. Thank you so much, Alistair and Beatrice and Sandra, Corinna and Domenico, and of course to Svetlana, who has made this all happen. And I'm going to hand you over to Svetlana to say a couple of final words.
Yes, I would also like to thank all the presenters who showed an amazing resilience in the face of traumatic situation, and you know, thank I guess the God of the internet for his or her divine intervention when it was all crashing down. But I think it was a very, very interesting workshop that you know, I totally enjoyed, and I also thought about my own research, because I did some sociological research with homeless people, and for them, you know, searching for home was something that was, you know, something which was the main purpose of their lives. So the concept of home, of Heimat, of identity, is something that unites all, you know, all of our disciplines. And so thank you, and I hope we will continue our conversation. Okay. Thanks a lot to everybody, and thanks for our participants for bearing with us and for your patience.
Thank you, Svetlana.
Put your camera on and we'll all wave and say goodbye. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.